Part 1. The Sleep-Inducing Mystery of Ancient Burial Rituals. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with something quietly eerie, but not in a jump-out-of-your-chair way. Settle into your chair, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, because we're about to meander through the slow, oddly mesmerizing world of ancient burial rituals. Think of it like a gentle lullaby, but with mummies and mysterious grave goods. Not your typical bedtime story, but calming in its own peculiar way. Burial rituals have been part of human culture for thousands of years, and they often reveal more about the living than the dead. People have always been fascinated with what happens after we shuffle off this mortal coil, and it turns out some of them went to extraordinary lengths to prepare. Some ancient folks apparently thought, sure, I'll die, but let's make it memorable, or at least make it slightly inconvenient for anyone who might stumble upon the remains later. Let's float over to ancient Egypt first, because they really set the gold standard for elaborate resting arrangements. Mummies, pyramids, canopic jars, the works. Of course, mummification wasn't just a neat cosmetic trick. It was believed that preserving the body preserved the soul, which is charming in a slightly obsessive way. Egyptians spent months dehydrating, wrapping, and aromatizing corpses. Yes, aromatizing, because nothing says eternal afterlife like a bit of myrrh and resin. The elite went further, commissioning massive tombs filled with statues, food, furniture, and even servants. Well, the servants were figurines, thankfully, because otherwise that would be inconvenient for the living. The tombs themselves were a kind of quiet performance. The dead were positioned just so, their arms crossed, their eyes facing the horizon, sometimes holding tiny ceremonial objects. It was a very deliberate, very still kind of choreography. And as anyone who has ever tried to rearrange IKEA furniture in dim light can appreciate, precise placement is exhausting. One can almost imagine the grave workers gently yawning as they adjusted yet another statuette, murmuring, "Yes, Pharaoh, this angle is perfect, just perfect." Meanwhile, over in Mesopotamia, things were a bit different. Graves here were smaller, simpler, often closer to the homes of the living. Families placed modest items beside the deceased, tools, jewelry, little clay bowls. Some of these bowls contained food, because ancient humans, like many of us, assumed the afterlife might involve snacking. One wonders if anyone ever checked back on a week-old offering and thought, maybe the dead don't appreciate hard bread and stale beer. There's something quietly melancholy about these practices. Burials were not just about superstition, they were expressions of care. People wanted to honor the dead, or at least make them comfortable, which is sweet if you ignore the occasional pyramid collapse. And in many cultures, the act of burial was slow, deliberate, almost ritualistically boring. A deliberate winding down, if you will, perfect for our sleepy exploration tonight. Speaking of slow, let's drift toward the Bronze Age in Europe. Burial hounds, or barrows, dotted the landscape. Some of these were massive, grassy hills covering the remains of chieftains. Inside, bodies were sometimes accompanied by horses, weapons, or even sacrificed companions. And yes, sacrificed companions. But let's note that they were few, which in historical terms was actually quite restrained. Archaeologists today find these mounds fascinating, spending years painstakingly uncovering tiny fragments of pottery or bone. And the process is, well, slower than watching paint dry, which is exactly the mood we're cultivating tonight. Then there's the slightly more macabre, yet strangely tranquil practice of bog bodies in Northern Europe. Bodies were deposited in peat bogs, naturally preserved in a manner that almost seems accidental. The water, the acidity, the cold, all combined to mummify the person without much human intervention. And yet, there was intention here too. Many of these individuals were placed carefully, often with offerings or items nearby. Some historians suggest ritual sacrifice, others propose executions with ceremonial significance. But regardless of intent, the result is hypnotically still. Faces frozen in serene or mildly uncomfortable expressions, hair and nails perfectly preserved, and clothing intact, as if nature itself decided to become a slow, meticulous embalmer. Moving to the Americas, civilizations like the Maya and the Inca had their own versions of careful, measured burial. The Maya often interred rulers in elaborate tombs beneath pyramids, accompanied by precious objects, including jade masks, gold figurines, and ceramics. These objects were not just status symbols, they were part of a narrative. They told the story of a ruler's life condensed into silent, still artifacts. And sometimes, the tombs were almost uncomfortably tight. The bodies were folded, placed carefully in restricted spaces, and surrounded by offerings that might have taken weeks to assemble. One imagines the tomb builders whispering, "Don't move a finger," literally. And the Inca, meanwhile, preferred mountain burials. High-altitude interments ensured the deceased were closer to the sky, perhaps closer to the gods. Bodies were often seated in the fetal position, wrapped in layers of cloth. Weather was, unsurprisingly, a factor. Freezing temperatures preserved the remains naturally. Some modern archaeologists describe these mummies as shockingly lifelike, as though the dead are merely napping, which is comforting, in a quiet, slightly creepy way. And even in China, ancient burials followed elaborate, if increasingly ritualistic patterns. The terracotta army is the most famous example, where thousands of life-sized clay soldiers stood in formation to guard the tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang. The emperor's actual burial chamber remains largely untouched, protected by legends of Mercury and curses. The scale is almost absurd. Hundreds of workers, countless hours, and yet all for one man's posthumous comfort. And perhaps a subtle reminder, humans have long had the tendency to overthink death. Now, let's not forget that not all rituals were about grandeur. Some were quietly simple, almost minimalistic. Neolithic communities in Europe, for instance, sometimes buried their dead in small pits with one or two items, a bead, a flint tool, a tiny bowl of food. The process was slow, reverent, understated, and in the monotony of these small gestures, there's a rhythm, a kind of meditative repetition. Exactly the sort of thing you could almost lull yourself to sleep imagining. What's fascinating across all these examples is a pattern. Humans tend to ritualize death, and in doing so, create spaces of extraordinary calm and slow attention. Tombs, graves, and burial mounds are, in their essence, spaces of stillness. The dead are quiet. The offerings are static. The rituals take time. It's almost as if every culture instinctively understood that the best way to honor mortality is to approach it slowly, methodically, without a rush. So as we drift through the history of burial rituals, we notice a gentle irony. The living were often frantic about eternity, yet the results were profoundly tranquil. Tombs, mounds, bogs, tombs, all designed for repose, all ultimately still. And for us tonight, the slow unfolding of these practices is strangely soporific. There's no rush, no climax, no sudden twist. Just the measured unfolding of human care and ceremonial obsession quietly whispering across centuries. And that, dear viewers, is a fitting start to our sleepy exploration. From Egypt to Europe, the Americas to China, humanity's approach to the dead has always been meticulous, ritualized, and curiously soothing. We're not rushing anywhere, because in the end, death is patient, and so are these stories. Let's linger for a moment on one last gentle curiosity: the use of grave goods. Across cultures, the inclusion of personal items for the afterlife was common. Some items were practical, like Part 2. Eccentric monarchs and their bizarre tombs. All right, if you're still awake, and if not, that's perfectly fine. This part works equally well as background noise. Let's drift from generic burial rituals to the more, shall we say, personalized side of eternal rest. Specifically, the ways in which monarchs, rulers, and elite eccentrics left behind resting places that perfectly reflected their personalities, or their insecurities, or occasionally both. Take, for instance, King Tutankhamun. Of course, he's famous, but maybe not for reasons that make you feel like checking your watch. Tut's tomb, discovered in 1922, was tiny by royal standards. Tiny, except for the treasures inside, which were, let's face it, the Egyptian version of "Look how rich I am." The treasures included golden thrones, chariots, and jewelry the size of small satellites. Tut's tomb also contained a death mask so carefully crafted that archaeologists still quietly wonder if the mask was designed to make him look perpetually sleepy, which, given the young king's early demise, seems ironically fitting. Then there's Pharaoh Ramses II, the man who decided one tomb simply wasn't enough. He commissioned dozens of mortuary temples and colossal statues, as though eternity were a real estate opportunity. Ramses seemed to think, why have one place for me to lie in peace when I could create an empire of stone? His body, eventually mummified with typical Egyptian precision, was accompanied by treasures designed to signal eternal authority, and, let's be honest, eternal stubbornness. The man had statues bigger than your average building. One wonders if anyone tasked with moving them sighed quietly, thinking, sure, because why not double down on grandeur? Now let's cross the Mediterranean to Europe, where monarchs were, if anything, just as meticulous, but often far stranger in their approach. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, is a perfect example. He died in 1715, having spent a lifetime being, well, extremely Louis XIV. His funeral was elaborate, extended over several days, and the body lay in state surrounded by riches and ceremonial pomp. Even in death, his advisors apparently worried about appearances. The body itself was eventually embalmed and placed in the Basilica of Saint Denis. But the ceremony was less about the afterlife and more about reinforcing the notion that yes, even after dying, Louis XIV remained the center of attention. Which brings us to another French monarch, Louis XV, who was buried not in the grandest sense, but in a way that reflected his awkward personal quirks. Unlike his predecessor, he seemed to prefer a quieter approach, though still accompanied by the trappings expected of royalty. Historians note that the subtle contrast between his life and posthumous presentation offers a gentle commentary on royal vanity. The more awkward the monarch, the more ceremonial the burial, as though death had to compensate for mortal personality flaws. Moving slightly northward, Part 3. The Odd and Tragic Lives of Royal Children. All right. Let's ease ourselves even deeper into the quiet corners of history. If you've made it this far, Good. Dim the lights further. Maybe adjust your blanket. And let's float into the strangely peculiar and often mildly tragic lives of royal children. Because if adult monarchs obsessed over tombs and eternal displays, the children, well, they had their own brand of unusual, slow-paced misfortune. Royal children have always had a special combination of privilege and peculiar restriction. Born into opulence, yet constrained by duty, tradition, and sometimes genetics. Let's start in the Habsburg dynasty, which seems like a masterclass in both. The family was infamous for intermarriage. Over generations, they were so genetically close that historians joke about the Habsburg jaw, a very prominent protruding jaw appearing repeatedly. The effect on children was often subtle, sometimes obvious. Some had drooping lips, slightly protruding teeth, and in extreme cases, physical or mental impairments. All of this, of course, was inherited quietly, slowly, over decades. For the children, life was a mix of privilege and, let's say, awkward anatomy. Then there's Charles II of Spain, a direct product of this intermarriage. He was born sickly and fragile, with a host of physical issues. Yet because he was the king, he couldn't just skip public appearances or avoid ceremonial duties. Life for him was a gentle parade of slow, careful motions, sitting on thrones, receiving dignitaries, and occasionally trying to swallow food without choking, a task historians note as surprisingly common. It's hard to imagine anything exciting in his days. Every gesture required consideration, patience, and, in a sense, a kind of meditative stillness, perfectly fitting for tonight's exploration of slow history. Across the Channel in France, young Louis XIV, who we mentioned earlier, had his own peculiar upbringing. He became king at the age of 5, which is ambitious for a child. His days were structured with obsessive precision. Meals at fixed times, lessons in etiquette, instruction in languages, and hours devoted to posture. Imagine being 5 years old, trying to sit perfectly still while being told how to hold your hands just so, all while the court quietly judges every twitch. Sleep might have been a welcome interruption. And yet, the tiny king eventually grew into the Sun King, the most ceremonially imposing monarch France had ever known. Early monotony, in retrospect, seems to have paid off. The English Royal. Part 4. Peculiar adult habits and eccentricities of royals. All right. We've wandered through the quiet, structured lives of royal children, and now it's time to drift into the adult phase. You know, the period when those same structured lives matured into bizarre habits, eccentric routines, and peculiar personal quirks. And of course, we'll approach it slowly, calmly, as if floating down a river of history rather than marching through it. Let's begin with Emperor Elagabalus of Rome. He ruled briefly, from 218 to 222 AD, but his habits linger in history like a faint, peculiar scent. He enjoyed extravagant banquets, often featuring unusual dishes and curious combinations. Imagine delicacies served slowly, each bite carefully considered, while attendants hover quietly nearby, waiting for permission to breathe. He reportedly also had a fondness for unusual clothing, sometimes wearing garments designed to provoke mild confusion among courtiers. Elagabalus's eccentricities were more about subtle disruption than chaos. And in a strangely hypnotic way, this makes his reign feel slow, like a long afternoon where nothing urgent truly happens. Meanwhile, in France, Louis XV had his own set of peculiarities. He enjoyed long, solitary walks through the gardens at Versailles, accompanied only by a handful of trusted aides. He liked to observe the growth of plants, the flight of birds, and the slow rhythm of nature. There's something quietly meditative about a king wandering alone among roses and fountains, seemingly oblivious to the grandeur around him. One imagines courtiers tiptoeing past, careful not to disturb the monarch's delicate contemplation. In England, George IV is another example of eccentricity expressed in slow, indulgent habits. He loved fashion, fine dining, and opulent furniture arrangements. His daily life revolved around rituals of grooming, wardrobe changes, and carefully timed meals. Even the process of relaxation became ceremonial. Imagine a king meticulously adjusting the folds of his silk robes while sipping a precisely measured cup of tea. Slow, deliberate, and oddly soothing for anyone observing from a quiet distance. Then there's the eccentric Catherine the Great of Russia. Though she's famous for political acumen and expansion of her empire, Catherine also had unusual routines. She insisted on detailed plans for her personal correspondence, her gardens, and even the arrangement of her bedchamber. Her life, though politically vibrant, was punctuated by slow, calculated personal rituals. Daily routines were observed with almost scientific precision. Her attention to minor detail created a rhythm, a quiet heartbeat amid the otherwise dynamic court life. It's as if she understood that the small, repetitive motions of everyday life were themselves a kind of meditation.
Part 5. Dynastic Inbreeding and Peculiar Genetics. All right, let's drift gently now into the quietly unsettling world of dynastic inbreeding. I promise no shocking horror stories, just slow, meticulous observations of how centuries of careful marriage planning shaped the bodies and habits of royalty. Settle in, maybe adjust your blanket again, and imagine generations of slow, deliberate genealogical planning. Royal families across Europe and beyond had a simple, persistent idea: keep the bloodline pure, which naturally involved marrying cousins, uncles, nieces, and sometimes more distant relatives. Over time, the effects were subtle, then more pronounced. Features repeated, quirks emerged, and occasionally life took on a slightly awkward rhythm. The Habsburgs, of course, are the classic example. Over centuries, they intermarried obsessively, producing what historians call the Habsburg jaw, a prominent, jutting lower jaw that appears in portraits like a slow, quiet refrain. Children born into the dynasty often had slightly odd facial structures, dental problems, and in extreme cases, physical or intellectual impairments. And yet life continued with the same deliberate ceremonial rhythm. Meals were still served in careful portions, lessons still proceeded in precise order, and every coronation followed slow, measured protocol. The genetic quirks became another layer of ritualized observation. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler of his line, is a particularly gentle illustration. He was frail, had difficulty moving and speaking, and carried the weight of centuries of intermarriage in his body. Yet his daily life remained regimented. Courtly appearances, careful meals, and long, quiet hours of observation. Even his disabilities were absorbed into the slow rhythm of ceremonial life. Imagine him, seated on his throne, moving cautiously, attendants tiptoeing around, everything deliberate, everything still. Then there's Queen Victoria and her descendants spread across Europe. She and Prince Albert practiced careful marital planning within royalty, unintentionally spreading certain genetic conditions like hemophilia. Children and grandchildren carried the trait quietly over decades, often affecting their daily routines. Careful attention was paid to minor injuries, slow observation ensured no accidents, and the lives of affected heirs were regulated in quiet, precise ways. It's fascinating how a single trait could ripple across generations, dictating minor rhythms and habits, all under the guise of careful royal planning. Even in France, the Bourbons had subtle genetic patterns emerge. Some children displayed slightly unusual facial features or frail constitutions. Life for these young royals was often slow and careful. Precise posture, controlled diet, scheduled lessons, and ceremonial activities. Nothing rushed, nothing impulsive. Every movement, from learning to walk in courtly halls to holding a scepter, was observed, monitored, and repeated. In a strangely hypnotic way, the effects of dynastic genetics reinforced the monotony of courtly life. Italy and the Medici family also offer examples. Marriages within close circles produced quiet but noticeable traits. Children were raised under careful observation, daily routines were meticulously structured, and physical peculiarities became just another layer in ceremonial life. Courtiers learned to navigate subtle differences, step lightly, adjust seating, and measure reactions. All these adjustments, repeated over generations, create a rhythm that's slow, hypnotic, and oddly meditative. In England, the Stuarts experienced similar subtleties. Certain physical traits, minor health conditions, and even delicate constitutions affected how young royals were raised. Lessons were scheduled carefully, meals were prepared with precision, and ceremonial appearances were meticulously timed. The quirks of genetics dictated a slower pace, one that shaped daily life without drawing attention to itself. Observers centuries later can almost hear the slow footsteps, the gentle adjustments, the quiet attentiveness surrounding each child. Even outside Europe, dynastic genetics had quiet effects. In ancient Egypt, some royal families practiced intra-family marriages to maintain divine bloodlines. Subtle physical traits were observed, rituals adapted, and children raised under careful supervision. Daily life was slow, repetitive, and deliberately structured, reflecting centuries of concern over lineage and inheritance. Every detail mattered, and every movement was measured. It's a gentle, repetitive rhythm that invites reflection, perfect for a sleepy evening. The Ottoman sultans also managed dynastic marriages strategically. Intermarriage within elite families ensured loyalty and continuity. Children often displayed minor physical peculiarities as a result, and their routines, lessons, meals, and ceremonial training were carefully structured to maintain the expected standards. The rhythm of life was slow, deliberate, and quietly obsessive, with genetics subtly reinforcing the repetition of daily habits. And it wasn't just physical traits. Certain behavioral tendencies, timidity, stubbornness, or meticulousness, seemed to recur across generations. Historians debate how much of this was nature, how much nurture, and how much the gentle pressure of ceremonial life amplified these traits. Regardless, the result was slow, measured behavior, carefully monitored movements, and daily routines imbued with quiet precision. The world of dynastic genetics, it turns out, is less about dramatic tragedy and more about centuries of subtle, hypnotic rhythm. In essence, inbreeding, intermarriage, and careful lineage management created a kind of human pattern, slow, deliberate, and repetitive. Children grew into adults with inherited quirks, and every generation followed similar rituals, routines, and ceremonial life. The palace, the court, and even private chambers became spaces of quiet observation, subtle adjustment, and gentle repetition. It's the perfect environment to imagine as you slowly settle further into calm tonight. So as we continue to float among the carefully measured lives of royalty, consider this subtle irony. The more rigid and repetitive the family planning, the more hypnotic the resulting rhythm of life.
Part 6. Curious Daily Rituals and Obsessions of Adult Royals. All right, let's continue our slow drift through history, lingering on the peculiar daily habits of monarchs and nobles. These are the small, repetitive routines and quiet obsessions that shaped their days and, indirectly, the rhythm of life in entire kingdoms. Nothing dramatic, nothing thrilling, just measured, oddly hypnotic quirks that defined centuries. Take Emperor Hirohito of Japan, for example. He reportedly had a deep fascination with marine biology. Each day he would spend hours observing sea creatures, quietly cataloging specimens, and sometimes sketching or writing notes. It wasn't urgent work. There were no emergencies demanding his attention. Just slow observation, the gentle rhythm of pen on paper, and the quiet contemplation of creatures moving through water. One can almost hear the soft ripple of koi in his palace ponds as he watched, perfectly still. Meanwhile, in France, Louis XVI had routines that were remarkably deliberate. He was often meticulous about daily meals, bathing schedules, and even how he dressed. There are records of him spending long, quiet moments ensuring his clothing fit just so, that the folds of fabric aligned, that buttons were perfectly positioned. The pace of court life often slowed around him, attendants moving with measured steps to avoid disturbing this ritualized process. One imagines the palace echoing with the soft sound of silk shifting, the quiet tap of shoes on polished floors, the gentle murmur of servants anticipating the next slow motion of the king. Across the Alps, Maria Theresa of Austria had her own gentle routines. Her day involved precise scheduling of prayer, study, correspondence, and supervision of her children. Every act was measured, deliberate, and quietly structured. Even her indulgences were slow. Walks in gardens, quiet reading, or attending Mass with ceremonial precision. The rhythm of her life was almost hypnotic, a measured cadence, punctuated only by necessary court business. Observing it from a distance, one could almost drift into the same calm repetition she experienced. Then there's Peter the Great, whose eccentricity was expressed in slow, rigorous routines. He demanded punctuality and adherence to schedules, not only from himself, but from those around him. Meals, inspections, meetings, they all followed precise timing. And yet, amidst the strictness, he incorporated personal obsessions, measuring canals, inspecting ships, and walking long distances through his cities.
Each act, no matter how unusual, was performed with deliberate attention. The monotony of routine, repeated over decades, has a strangely calming rhythm if you let your mind drift along with it. In England, George III offers another quietly hypnotic example. Known for episodes of mental illness, he nonetheless maintained careful habits when well. Breakfast, correspondence, briefings, walks, meals, reading, each task assigned a precise place in the day. The court adjusted to his patterns, moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, to maintain a gentle flow around the king's routines. One imagines the subtle music of palace life, soft footfalls, pages turning, teacups set gently on saucers, the quiet echo of habitual repetition. And we shouldn't overlook personal collections. Monarchs often spent long hours arranging artworks, coins, manuscripts, or natural curiosities. Each item was placed carefully, its orientation and spacing considered. Small adjustments were made over weeks or months. The pace was glacial by modern standards. But it's this very slowness that allows us, centuries later, to drift along with the rhythm, imagining the quiet precision, the soft rustle of papers, the gentle clink of coins being aligned. Even indulgences followed gentle ritual. Edward VII of England loved meals, cigars, and leisurely drives. Yet even these were scheduled, observed, and performed in a quiet cadence. The rhythm of his day, measured by culinary indulgence and slow travel, mirrors the hypnotic pattern we've been tracing throughout these centuries of royalty. So, as we settle into this slow panorama of daily rituals, one subtle truth emerges. The eccentricities of monarchs are often less about spectacle and more about careful pacing. They reveal a human tendency toward quiet obsession, deliberate repetition, and measured indulgence. Observing them across centuries, we see a rhythm of life that is slow, gentle, and oddly soothing. So, for tonight, as you listen, imagine the quiet corridors, the softly shifting curtains, the faint rustle of silk robes, the meticulous arrangement of furniture or art. Imagine emperors and kings and queens moving deliberately, one step at a time, absorbed in personal habits that seem trivial but define the cadence of entire courts. It's hypnotic, gentle, and perfectly suited to a late evening of drifting attention and soft reflection.
Part 7. Peculiar Funerary Requests and Posthumous Eccentricities. Now that we've drifted through the quiet daily routines of monarchs, let's float gently into what happens after life officially ends. The slow, deliberate, sometimes peculiar ways in which royals arranged their own posthumous display. Funerals, tombs, and crypts often reveal as much about personality as life itself. And in many cases, they're hypnotically, meticulously odd. Take Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China, for instance. He's famous for the terracotta army, thousands of life-sized soldiers designed to guard him in the afterlife. But it wasn't just a matter of quantity, it was all meticulously planned. The soldiers were arranged with weapons, carefully positioned according to military strategy, as if he expected imaginary battles to unfold long after he was gone. And even today, the silent clay figures seem frozen in anticipation. There's no rush in this vision. Everything is still, controlled, slowly, patiently arranged over decades. Over in Egypt, we already know about mummies and pyramids, but some pharaohs took their posthumous obsession to new levels. Ramses II, for example, had multiple tombs, each designed with intricate carvings, statues, and inscriptions that essentially narrate his greatness forever. And then, in a slightly ironic twist, his mummy was moved several times over the centuries. Each relocation was performed carefully, respectfully, yet slowly. Imagine a royal being shuffled quietly from tomb to tomb, each step deliberate, measured, with attendants tiptoeing across centuries. It's almost soporific. Back in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte's posthumous journey is quietly fascinating. He died in exile on St. Helena in 1821, a small island in the South Atlantic, far from the pomp of Paris. Initially buried there, his body remained undisturbed for decades, and then much later he was ceremoniously exhumed, embalmed again, and transported to Paris. The elaborate care, the slow, multi-decade process of arranging his final resting place, and the precise ceremonial procedures reflect both the reverence for legacy and the hypnotic patience of history. Then there's the curious case of King Henry VIII. Known for multiple marriages and somewhat impulsive governance, he nonetheless had precise ideas about his own burial. His tomb in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, is carefully structured, with Henry placed between Jane Seymour and other royal predecessors. The tomb's design, though grand, is methodical. Symmetry, placement, and measured visual hierarchy. The planning itself, conducted quietly before death, reflects a slow obsession with legacy, status, and appearance. Let's drift northward to Sweden, where King Gustav III was assassinated in 1792. His funeral and subsequent tomb were carefully orchestrated, with ceremonial rituals performed with deliberate, unhurried attention. Even in death, the monarch's presence dictated the pace of the surrounding world. Attendants and mourners moved slowly, their actions measured by custom and tradition. And for anyone imagining the scene today, the quiet solemnity is oddly hypnotic. In Russia, the Romanovs left behind some of the most meticulously orchestrated posthumous rituals. The elaborate burial procedures of the 18th and 19th centuries involves slow, precise embalming, ceremonial dressings, and placement in sarcophagi within ornate crypts. Even after tragic deaths, the bodies were preserved and displayed with attention to minute details. It's a kind of calm, ritualistic choreography. Soft footsteps, faint candlelight, careful arrangement of royal garments. Every act deliberate, almost hypnotically slow. A slightly more peculiar example comes from the Ottoman Empire. Some sultans requested that their tombs be uniquely designed to reflect personal tastes or philosophical beliefs. Sultan Mahmud II, for instance, oversaw intricate designs for his mausoleum, ensuring that every detail, from tile patterns to the alignment of doors, was precisely as he envisioned. The process of creation was slow, deliberate, and carefully supervised. One can almost imagine him, long before death, quietly inspecting every plan, measuring angles, making tiny adjustments over the years. Even Queen Victoria, after her passing, had her tomb arranged according to precise, careful specifications. Though less eccentric than some of her male counterparts, she still required certain objects, inscriptions, and positioning to reflect her personal vision. Courtiers, architects, and royal artisans followed instructions with measured patience, creating a final resting place that mirrored the same deliberate rhythm of her daily life. And let's not forget the personal eccentricities that manifest in posthumous requests beyond placement or decoration. Some monarchs requested unusual items in their coffins, favorite foods, symbolic objects, or even pets. These small gestures, often carried out with extreme care, added subtle personal rhythm to funerary procedures. The slow placement of items, the quiet adjustments of fabric, and the gentle positioning of symbolic objects create a meditative cadence across history. In many ways, the posthumous habits of royals echo their living routines, slow, meticulous, and deeply personal. Even in death, they orchestrate their environment, dictate the pace of action, and exert quiet control over centuries to come. Observers, historians, and modern visitors can't help but feel the hypnotic cadence of such precise, deliberate arrangements. So, as we drift tonight among tombs, crypts, and mausoleums, imagine quiet halls lit by flickering candlelight, attendants moving softly, and bodies carefully positioned according to centuries of planning. Everything is still. Everything is controlled. Time itself seems to slow, stretching each moment into a gentle rhythm of ceremony and observation. And for us, centuries later, the hypnotic stillness of posthumous royal life is perfect for settling into calm, measured reflection.
Part 8. Quirks of Courtiers and Royal Servants. Alright, let's float a little further into the quiet, almost hypnotic world surrounding monarchs, the courtiers, attendants, and servants whose lives were intertwined with royalty. They weren't crowned, they didn't have palaces in their names, yet their days were often shaped by the eccentric rhythms, slow obsessions, and meticulous habits of those they served. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear their soft footsteps echoing in history's quiet corridors. Take, for instance, the attendants of the French court under Louis XIV. The Sun King's obsession with ceremony trickled down to every servant. Tasks were assigned with ritualized precision. An attendant might spend hours simply adjusting a cushion, folding a robe, or ensuring the alignment of a candlestick. Nothing hurried, nothing abrupt. Every gesture was slow, deliberate, and measured to match the monarch's meticulous eye. The rhythm of service was hypnotic, soft rustles of silk, quiet whispers of instruction, and subtle movements repeated daily with clockwork consistency. Meanwhile, in England, servants under Queen Victoria experienced a slightly different cadence. The Queen's personal habits, careful dressing, structured meals, regimented correspondence dictated the pace of the household. Attendants quietly observed her routines, learned to anticipate needs, and moved in almost choreographed patterns. A gown had to be brushed and folded in precise ways, letters had to be prepared exactly according to her preferences, and meals timed with slow, deliberate care. Life was predictable, repetitive, and in its own way, quietly meditative. In Russia, the Romanov courtiers experienced a similar hypnotic routine. The daily life of the imperial household revolved around slow ceremonial observation. Servants polished objects, arranged ceremonial garments, and assisted with rituals that seemed to stretch endlessly. For example, preparing for court events might take hours, with attendants moving quietly in the background, each step calculated and deliberate. And when the day ended, the quiet stillness of the palaces allowed for a kind of collective exhale. Soft footsteps, low murmurs, and carefully arranged furniture reflecting centuries of ritual. Even courtiers' personal habits were influenced by proximity to power. Some developed obsessive routines to maintain favor, memorizing minor gestures of the monarch, ensuring that objects were always aligned in precise configurations, or monitoring subtle environmental details like lighting and scent. Their existence became an extension of royal rhythm, a slow echo of the monarch's personal cadence. Imagine centuries of attendants, quietly moving through dim corridors, their soft, synchronized steps blending into the palace atmosphere, a living backdrop of stillness. In France, the Dauphin's attendants had to anticipate every whim of the heir, no matter how minor. A misplaced chair, an incorrectly arranged book, or even a momentary lapse in posture could ripple through the household with quiet consequences. Servants moved slowly, measured, and attentively, as though aware that every gesture was part of a centuries-old choreography. Over time, this repetition reinforced habits that became second nature, almost a meditative rhythm born from obligation. Similarly, in Japan, attendants of emperors and aristocrats observed strict, deliberate routines. They maintained gardens, prepared ceremonial spaces, and supervised small objects with meticulous care. The rhythm of their lives mirrored that of the people they served, slow, careful, and deeply ritualized. Every tea ceremony, every bow, every adjustment of a screen or textile followed patterns perfected over decades. For an observer, imagining these motions is almost like watching a pendulum swing gently, predictably, and endlessly. Even minor missteps had to be corrected with patience. A servant spilling tea would quietly clean and reset the space, ensuring no disruption to the hypnotic rhythm of palace life. A misaligned tapestry would be carefully adjusted. Silence was expected, and movement was deliberate. These seemingly trivial corrections contributed to an atmosphere of calm, repetitive precision that extended across centuries of royal households. One of the more curious aspects of courtly life is how small personal quirks of monarchs created entire subcultures of servant rituals. Louis XIV's obsession with light and shadow required attendants to adjust lamps and mirrors multiple times a day. Catherine the Great's preference for reading late into the evening meant that attendants quietly handled candles, books, and furniture for hours. These minor adjustments, repeated endlessly, became rituals in themselves. Over time, generations of courtiers internalized this rhythm, moving slowly and deliberately without conscious thought. Even food preparation had its slow choreography. Meals were not only about nutrition, they were ceremonial. Ingredients were carefully measured, dishes arranged with aesthetic precision, and each course presented according to meticulous timing. Observing these routines today, one might imagine the soft clink of silverware, the faint steam rising from pots, and the gentle, unhurried placement of each plate. It's the kind of detail that can lull a listener into a slow, reflective calm. Ultimately, courtiers and servants functioned as extensions of royal eccentricities. Their lives were shaped by slow repetition, careful observation, and subtle responsiveness. The combination of ritual, observation, and gentle obedience created an almost hypnotic rhythm. Soft footsteps, faint rustles of silk, whispered instructions, and the steady pulse of palace life moving in perfect cadence. So as we drift among these quiet corridors tonight, imagine the soft echoes of history, courtiers adjusting robes, attendants polishing objects, gentle footsteps on marble floors. The lives of those who served monarchs were slow, deliberate, and subtly mesmerizing, a perfect companion to the hypnotic rhythms of kings, queens, and emperors themselves.
Part 9. Bizarre Personal Collections and Strange Hobbies. Now, let's drift into the quietly fascinating world of royal collections and personal hobbies. These are not grand battles or dramatic intrigues, but slow, meticulous obsessions that reveal the peculiar rhythm of noble life. Imagine centuries of rulers surrounded by objects carefully curated, arranged, and contemplated with gentle patience. Take King George III of England, who had a profound interest in botany. He collected plant specimens, pressed them in books, and catalogued their characteristics with deliberate care. Each leaf and flower was examined, labeled, and stored according to strict routines. One can almost picture him leaning over a table, gently brushing dust from a pressed fern, quietly observing its veins, absorbing its details with slow, deliberate attention. The pace of life in such moments is soft, methodical, and hypnotic. Meanwhile, Catherine the Great of Russia amassed one of the most impressive art collections in European history. But her interest wasn't merely in possession. She studied each piece, sometimes for hours, examining detail, color, and composition. Painting by painting, sculpture by sculpture, she moved slowly, deliberately, absorbing the quiet rhythms of her collection. Attendants followed, adjusting frames, opening shutters, and quietly ensuring optimal light, all performed in soft, unhurried motions. Over in France, Louis XIV had personal collections of miniatures, medals, and coins. Each object was arranged, catalogued, and sometimes rearranged over years, with attendants assisting in the careful placement. He might spend a quiet afternoon moving small items slightly, observing symmetry, adjusting spacing. The slow, meticulous care given to these objects mirrors the measured pace of his ceremonial life. Observing it from a distance, it's almost meditative. Soft clinks of coins, gentle shuffles of drawers, quiet contemplation across a polished desk. Even outside Europe, monarchs engaged in similar slow obsessions. Emperor Qianlong of China, for instance, had extensive collections of calligraphy, porcelain, and ancient artifacts. He didn't merely acquire them, he catalogued, arranged, and annotated each piece with deliberate care. The rhythm of arranging a collection, examining brush strokes or ceramic patterns, is hypnotic in its repetition, extending over months, sometimes decades. Each act is slow, measured, almost ritualistic. Royal hobbies could also be surprisingly quiet and detailed. Frederick the Great of Prussia was an accomplished flutist, often playing for hours in private. His movements were deliberate, notes measured, fingers pressing keys with slow precision. Music became a personal ritual, a gentle counterbalance to the ceremonial rigidity of court life. The soft, repetitive motion of playing, combined with long, reflective pauses, mirrors the quiet rhythm found in many aspects of royal life. And then there's Queen Victoria, who had a keen interest in photography. She took portraits, observed composition, and sometimes personally adjusted scenes with measured, meticulous care. Hours would pass slowly as she experimented with light, placement, and framing. The pace was gentle, precise, and entirely unhurried, yet obsessive in the quietest, most hypnotic sense. Collections and hobbies were also used to mark status and power, but often in ways that emphasized patience over spectacle. Louis XV's interest in exotic animals, for instance, resulted in menageries of carefully tended creatures. Observing, feeding, and cataloging these animals became a slow, repeated activity that involved attendants and naturalists moving with quiet precision. Each task, feeding, cleaning, observing, was done deliberately, creating a steady rhythm within the palace grounds. Sometimes these obsessions veered toward the peculiar. Charles II of Spain reportedly collected oddities in cabinets, from shells to insects, arranging them with precise care. Each specimen was catalogued, observed, and stored, a microcosm of the same slow, deliberate order imposed on his kingdom. Imagine tiny glass jars, carefully labeled, quietly aligned in rows, each one reflecting decades of measured attention. Even seemingly mundane tasks, gardening, bird-watching, arranging furniture, or adjusting decorative objects, became part of the hypnotic rhythm of courtly life. Monarchs often repeated these activities daily, softly, slowly, in the same measured cadence as their ceremonial duties. The courtiers, servants, and attendants mirrored this pace, creating a quiet, immersive rhythm that extended across entire palaces. In essence, the slow obsessions, quiet hobbies, and meticulous collections of royalty reveal a pattern: repetition, gentle attention to detail, and hypnotic patience.
The pace of life in these private spaces is soft, measured, and unhurried, a stark contrast to the chaos often imagined in tales of power and conquest. For modern listeners, it's calming to picture soft footsteps echoing across galleries, hands gently arranging objects, eyes quietly observing, all unfolding over decades of patient care. So, as we drift among these quiet obsessions tonight, imagine the gentle rustle of papers, the faint clink of coins or porcelain, the soft tuning of a musical instrument. The world of royal hobbies and collections is a slow-moving landscape where time stretches, repetition lulls, and the subtle rhythm of centuries becomes a quiet, almost meditative companion.
Part 10. Reflections on the hypnotic rhythm of royal life. Now, as we settle into the final stretch of our quiet journey, let's pause and reflect on what we've drifted through tonight. We've wandered through centuries of carefully structured lives, observed peculiar habits, and floated among the slow, repetitive rhythms of monarchs, courtiers, and their attendants. And if you've been listening closely, you might notice a subtle, almost meditative pattern emerging. The lives of kings, queens, emperors, and princes were not filled with the constant excitement we often imagine. Instead, they were governed by gentle repetition, meticulous attention to small details, and oddly soothing rituals. Everything had a pace, a rhythm. Meals were slow, clothing and personal appearance were managed with care. Objects and collections were aligned, catalogued, and observed. Even leisure was deliberate, often quiet, and strangely hypnotic. Consider how daily life, from the tiniest child monarch to the most eccentric adult emperor, was shaped by a continuous flow of structured routines. Play, study, meals, ceremonies, walks, and even personal hobbies were repeated with methodical precision. Observing these patterns is like watching water flow slowly over smooth stones. Nothing rushes, nothing startles, everything follows its own gentle path. And there's something quietly comforting about this. In a world often imagined as turbulent, royal life, at least in its private rhythms, was slow, predictable, and controlled. Each monarch and attendant contributed to a gentle cadence, a soft pulse of activity that persisted over decades and centuries. The repetition, the careful pacing, and the subtle eccentricities all blend into a lullaby of history. Even in death, this rhythm continued. Funerals, tombs, mausoleums, and posthumous collections were orchestrated with meticulous care. Every placement, every candle, every object in a coffin was arranged deliberately. Silence, careful motion, and repetition defined the final chapters of life, reinforcing the same hypnotic pattern we observed in living routines. The echoes of these practices linger centuries later, soft and persistent. We also glimpsed the quiet ripple effect of genetics, intermarriage, and dynastic planning. Physical quirks, frail constitutions, and inherited tendencies shaped daily routines, personal habits, and the pace of life. These subtle influences added to the hypnotic cadence of royal households, creating a world where time stretched gently, and every movement, thought, and gesture was measured and deliberate. Throughout this exploration, irony quietly threaded its way through the narrative. Great power, immense wealth, and historical prominence were often accompanied by strangely quiet, almost monotonous personal lives. The same rulers who dictated empires spent hours adjusting a cushion, observing a flower, or cataloging a shell.
The juxtaposition of immense authority with minute obsession is oddly soothing when imagined slowly, step by step, day by day. So, as we drift to the end of this long, gentle journey, let's linger in that calm. Imagine courtiers tiptoeing along echoing halls, monarchs adjusting objects with measured care, children moving slowly through ceremonial lessons, and attendants quietly performing their daily rituals. Time stretches, repetition hums softly, everything is still, deliberate, and strangely comforting. The hypnotic rhythm of royal life is not glamorous, not fast-paced, and not dramatic, but it is complete. It is full of quiet detail, repetition, and peculiar charm. And perhaps as you let your mind wander among the faint echoes of silk robes, polished floors, and softly rustling papers, you might feel a gentle, calming lull taking hold, an echo of history that whispers softly across centuries. Tonight, the past has moved slowly, deliberately, and unhurriedly, and if you followed along, you've traveled with it. From tiny infant kings to eccentric emperors, from meticulous courtiers to carefully placed tombs, history has unfolded in a quiet cadence. And now, in this moment, you can rest, letting the soft rhythm of centuries settle around you, gentle, hypnotic, and slow. Good night, and may the quiet pace of history carry you gently into dreams.
Part 11. Gentle Oddities and the Little Things That Defined Royal Life. Even after centuries of observing monarchs, courtiers, and their slow, deliberate routines, there remains a quiet world of small, overlooked eccentricities. These are the subtle gestures, tiny indulgences, and minute personal habits that never made history books in full, yet shaped the rhythm of palaces across continents. Let's drift through a few of these, slowly, deliberately, like a soft evening breeze. Consider Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire. He had a quiet fascination with alchemy and astronomy. Instead of grand public ceremonies, he would spend hours in dimly lit chambers, quietly observing planets, mixing powders, and cataloging metals. His obsessions were private, repetitive, and oddly meditative. Courtiers learned to move gently through his chambers, never interrupting his slow, methodical experiments. One can almost imagine the soft scratching of quills on parchment and the faint clinking of glass beakers echoing through a quiet palace. In England, Queen Anne developed an almost ritualized attachment to her pets. She reportedly had a stable of favorite dogs, each tended with slow precision. Feeding, walking, grooming, every interaction was carefully timed and repeated daily. The dogs themselves became part of a soft rhythm in the palace. Soft footfalls, quiet obedience, and tiny routines unfolding in parallel with the ceremonial life of the court. Some monarchs had peculiar hobbies that were slow, repetitive, and oddly hypnotic. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, for instance, enjoyed walking for hours in palace gardens, observing flowers, statues, and fountains. These walks were not hurried. They were deliberate, contemplative, and sometimes performed multiple times a day. The attendants mirrored this pace, moving softly and quietly, ensuring the path remained orderly. One imagines the soft trickle of water from fountains, leaves rustling in the wind, and the slow, measured cadence of imperial footsteps. Meanwhile, in France, Louis XVI had an affinity for locksmithing. He spent quiet hours tinkering with locks, carefully manipulating mechanisms and studying their inner workings. This private, slow-moving hobby reflected the broader rhythm of his life, deliberate, meticulous, and strangely soothing. It's the kind of activity that lulls the mind, even centuries later, when we imagine the king slowly turning keys and examining intricate designs. Even minor personal quirks added layers to the hypnotic texture of households. Some rulers preferred their curtains drawn just so, their chairs adjusted to precise angles, or their meals served in exact sequences. Servants learned to anticipate these subtleties, moving slowly and quietly, almost in sync with the rhythms of the monarch's body and mood. The palace itself became a gentle, living organism, each motion deliberate and harmonized. Then there were subtle social rituals. Courtiers practiced quiet gestures of respect, the precise angle of a bow, the measured pace of approach, the slow unfolding of ceremonial notes. These motions, repeated daily, created a soft, repetitive cadence throughout the palace. Observing them now, we can almost hear the faint rustle of fabric, the soft shuffle of feet, and the gentle murmur of whispered instructions, an echo of centuries of quiet routine. Even palace architecture reflected a hypnotic rhythm. Long corridors, echoing halls, and symmetrical gardens encouraged measured movement. Monarchs often walked these spaces slowly, stopping occasionally to observe a detail, a statue, a painting, or a carefully pruned tree. Every step, every glance was deliberate. Over decades, the palace itself became a stage for quiet observation, repetition, and subtle reflection. And finally, personal diaries and letters added another layer of slow contemplation. Many monarchs meticulously recorded daily events, thoughts, or minor reflections. The act of writing, repetitive and careful, mirrors the hypnotic quality of palace life. Pens scratched softly, ink flowed slowly, and pages accumulated over decades, a quiet testament to the gentle rhythms of personal and political life alike. So, as we conclude this gentle drift through history tonight, picture the slow footsteps, soft rustles, and deliberate movements of centuries gone by. The world of royalty, with all its peculiarities, quirks, and many rituals, offers a calm, measured reflection of human life, one that can lull the mind, soothe the imagination, and carry you gently into quiet reverie. Good night once again, and may the soft rhythm of history accompany your dreams.
Part 12. The subtle, mundane details that shaped royal life. Even after 11 parts of drifting through centuries of slow, deliberate habits, there remains a quiet world of the nearly invisible, small, mundane details that structured daily life for monarchs and their households. These are the subtle rhythms, repeated gestures, and tiny adjustments that rarely make the history books, but are hypnotically soothing to imagine. Take, for example, the careful folding of linens in palaces. A king's sheets, a queen's robes, or a ceremonial banner had to be aligned perfectly. Courtiers and servants spent hours smoothing fabrics, adjusting folds, and ensuring symmetry. The motions were slow, repetitive, and precise, repeated daily and observed for subtle changes over time. It's a rhythm that's soft, almost meditative, echoing through the halls. Then there's the pacing of ceremonial gardens. Monarchs like Louis XIV, Peter the Great, and Frederick the Great often spent hours walking among carefully arranged plants, statues, and fountains. They measured distances, observed patterns, and adjusted elements slowly, deliberately. The attendants mirrored their movements, walking softly, pausing at intervals, adjusting shrubs or small decorations. Each step, each breath contributes to the hypnotic flow of space. Meals, too, were an exercise in quiet repetition. Dishes were served in careful order, utensils aligned, portions measured. Monarchs like Catherine the Great or Edward VII approached their meals as a slow, deliberate ritual. The sound of silverware, the subtle clink of china, and the gentle hum of conversation create a low, continuous cadence, softly echoing the broader rhythm of palace life. Minor personal quirks of rulers also shaped daily routines. Some required objects to be precisely positioned, chairs at exact angles, doors closed just so. Others preferred certain lighting conditions, the gentle filtering of sunlight through heavy curtains, or the exact number of candles in a room. Courtiers adapted, moving slowly, adjusting each element in a precise, almost hypnotic dance of service and observation. Even animals contributed to this gentle rhythm. Monarchs across Europe and Asia maintained stables, aviaries, and menageries. Feeding, grooming, and arranging animals followed strict schedules. Servants moved quietly through corridors and courtyards, observing the animals, the timing of each task, and the subtle changes in behavior. Life unfolded at the pace dictated by both humans and creatures alike. Royal travel, while sometimes grand, also followed a slow cadence. Carriages, horses, and attendants moved deliberately, ensuring comfort, protocol, and careful observation of surroundings. Each journey was a miniature repetition of palace routines, measured motion, controlled gestures, and soft, consistent pacing. Even a trip through city streets or countryside reflected the hypnotic order of the court. Royal leisure was similarly deliberate. Playing a musical instrument, observing art, reading books, or practicing calligraphy all demanded patience, repetition, and quiet focus. Tsar Nicholas I, Emperor Hirohito, or Louis XVI would spend long hours immersed in a single hobby, repeating motions, observing minute details, and moving with soft, careful precision. Over decades, these small rituals shaped the invisible architecture of time in palaces and courts. Minor habits like adjusting hats, straightening gloves, or aligning objects on desks added layers to the repetitive rhythm. Every gesture was observed, repeated, and refined, producing a world that moved slowly, predictably, and with hypnotic calm. Even the faintest errors prompted measured corrections, soft, deliberate, and unobtrusive. By observing these quiet, almost imperceptible details, we gain a deeper understanding of the monotony, repetition, and subtle eccentricity that underpinned centuries of royal life. Time itself seems to stretch and slow when imagined through these routines, inviting the listener into a gentle, meditative reflection on the lives of the powerful, yet oddly constrained. So, as we settle into the end of Part 12, picture softly moving hands, the rustle of fabric, the measured steps of attendants, the quiet alignment of objects, and the gentle repetition of daily life. Every small, mundane detail contributes to a hypnotic cadence, allowing history to unfold slowly, deliberately, and with comforting, almost sleepy rhythm. Good night, once again, as the quiet patterns of centuries carry you softly into your dreams. Part 13.
Small ceremonial oddities and quiet habits. Even after 12 parts, there remains a quiet, almost imperceptible layer of history, the small ceremonial oddities and understated habits that quietly structured royal life. These are not grand battles or public spectacles, but subtle rituals that repeated over decades and centuries, soft, deliberate, and hypnotic. Take, for instance, the arrangement of chairs and thrones in ceremonial halls. Monarchs often required exact spacing, precise angles, and specific orientations to align with light, shadow, or architectural symmetry. Courtiers and attendants spent long hours adjusting positions, sometimes minute by minute, to ensure perfect alignment. The soft scraping of feet across polished floors, the gentle nudge of chair legs, and the hushed whispers of approval or correction created a slow, steady rhythm, softly hypnotic if imagined carefully. Even the timing of gestures was controlled. In courts from Versailles to Vienna, a bow or curtsy had to be executed with deliberate pacing. Too quick, too slow, and the rhythm was off. Attendants and courtiers trained for years to internalize these cadences, moving like soft currents around the central figure of the monarch. Observing this today, we can almost hear the gentle swish of robes, the faint shuffle of shoes, and the subtle cadence of motion stretching across vast halls. Ritualized meals offer another quietly hypnotic scene. Monarchs like Maria Theresa or Louis XV had each course served at precise intervals. Napkins had to be folded perfectly, utensils aligned with gentle exactitude. Even minor changes, a tilted cup, misaligned plate, were corrected with soft, deliberate care. The repetition of these gestures over decades created a slow, almost meditative rhythm that defined palace life. Small daily habits, sometimes overlooked, contributed equally. Kings might adjust their gloves, queens their hairpins, princes their shoes, always under quiet supervision. Attendants moved in near silence, anticipating corrections, making subtle adjustments, and preserving the measured cadence of personal ritual. Each tiny act, repeated countless times, reinforced a hypnotic flow across the palace. Gardens, too, were an extension of this rhythm. Courtiers and gardeners followed slow, meticulous routines, pruning, aligning statues, adjusting fountains. Monarchs would walk, observing every detail, sometimes stopping for hours at a single flower, statue, or patterned hedge. The slow repetition, combined with quiet observation, created a gently hypnotic landscape where every gesture contributed to a soft, continuous cadence. Even clothing rituals were carefully orchestrated. Ribbons had to be aligned, buttons fastened with exact care, layers adjusted repeatedly. Dressing or undressing became a quiet, deliberate ceremony, often lasting for hours. The soft rustle of fabric, the faint click of buttons, and the measured motions of attendants reinforced a hypnotic repetition that defined daily life. Some monarchs developed subtly odd habits, repeated day after day. Emperor Peter the Great reportedly liked to inspect every corner of his residences slowly, checking furniture, objects, and even windows for alignment or cleanliness. Queen Victoria measured letters and correspondence with careful scrutiny. Louis XIV adjusted candlelight to perfection, softening shadows across his chambers. Each habit was minor in isolation, but repeated over decades, they wove a calm, persistent rhythm into the life of the court. Even in leisure, repetition ruled. Music practice, reading, embroidery, or calligraphy all followed slow, deliberate paces. Each note, line, or stitch was observed carefully, repeated if necessary, and integrated into the larger flow of palace life. The result is a quiet, continuous rhythm of human activity, soft and persistent, almost like the gentle pulse of a heartbeat across centuries. In essence, these small ceremonial oddities and quiet habits reveal a consistent theme. The lives of royalty were carefully structured, deliberately paced, and subtly eccentric. Every motion, gesture, and ritual repeated slowly, creating a hypnotic cadence that shaped centuries of history and defined the silent music of palaces. As we drift to the close of Part 13, imagine corridors stretching endlessly, attendants gliding softly, objects carefully aligned, shadows falling just so, and soft footsteps echoing across marble. The gentle, repetitive patterns of history creates a lullaby-like atmosphere, perfect for late-night reflection or gentle, sleepy contemplation. Good night once more, as the soft, deliberate rhythm of royal life carries you into a calm, reflective state.
Part 14. The gentle rhythm of royal correspondence. Even beyond daily routines, collections, and ceremonial oddities, monarchs maintained a surprisingly slow, deliberate rhythm in communication. Letters, dispatches, and messages were not just functional. They were carefully curated, meticulously written, and often repeated with extraordinary patience. These quiet practices created another layer of hypnotic cadence in royal life. Consider Louis XIV of France. He wrote hundreds of letters each year, addressing ministers, family, and distant rulers. But the process was not rushed. Letters were drafted, copied, revised, and sometimes rewritten entirely. Each word was measured for precision, politeness, and subtle nuance. Courtiers and secretaries assist him with careful transcription, moving softly through quiet chambers, ensuring every sheet was aligned, every line neat. The rhythm of this process, draft, revise, copy, deliver, unfolded slowly, day after day, year after year. Meanwhile, in Russia, Catherine the Great maintained a vast correspondence with philosophers, foreign dignitaries, and family. Her letters were sometimes several pages long, filled with careful observations, reflections, and occasional dry humor. Secretaries and attendants handled the writing, folding, and sealing with methodical precision. Over decades, the repetitive cadence of letter writing shaped not just her day, but the subtle pulse of the royal court. Even in smaller kingdoms, communication followed a hypnotic rhythm. Emperor Hirohito of Japan would often write notes on marine specimens, scientific observations, and administrative matters, which were then carefully filed or passed to aides. Each act of writing, reviewing, and filing was deliberate, quiet, and slow, part of a broader rhythm that governed both personal and public life. The process of receiving letters was equally ritualized. Courtiers sorted messages, presented them in a precise order, and awaited acknowledgement. Monarchs read slowly, sometimes aloud to attendants or advisors, considering each phrase with patient attention. Even minor delays or errors were handled with quiet correction rather than urgency. Imagine soft rustling of paper, faint scratching of quills, and gentle murmurs of discussion, an echoing rhythm of centuries past. Some rulers developed highly personal habits around correspondence. Queen Victoria, for example, would annotate letters with careful margin notes, sometimes returning to them days or weeks later to add reflections or corrections. The repetition of reviewing, adjusting, and rereading letters created a slow, continuous cadence, a rhythm that extended beyond a single day, slowly weaving into the fabric of court life. In England, George III had a similar slow engagement with communication. He carefully read reports from ministers, wrote annotations, and occasionally dictated responses in a calm, measured pace. The act of handling correspondence became a gentle meditation. Soft voice, deliberate gestures, quiet attention. Over decades, this steady repetition established a hypnotic flow that permeated his household. Even international diplomacy moved at a slow pace. Messages were sent by courier, crossing borders over days or weeks, often carefully monitored and repeatedly reviewed. Monarchs would spend quiet hours considering phrasing, tone, and intent, ensuring that every word maintained the proper rhythm of diplomacy.
The process was deliberate, patient, and unhurried, softly extending the rhythm of personal and political life. This gentle cadence of royal correspondence extended beyond letters. Official proclamations, ceremonial invitations, and personal notes all followed similar patterns. Every document was crafted, reviewed, and presented with meticulous attention. The soft rustling of paper, the gentle scratching of pens, and the careful folding and sealing of envelopes created a hypnotic, continuous rhythm. So as we drift through these quiet chambers of history, picture soft light filtering over polished desks, hands moving slowly across parchment, quills scratching at measured pace, and attendants tiptoeing to deliver or organize documents. The subtle repetition of writing, reviewing, and sending correspondence forms another layer of hypnotic rhythm in royal life. A rhythm that extends beyond daily routines, collections, and ceremonies. Tonight, as we let the faint cadence of letters, notes, and messages wash over us, the quiet pulse of centuries seems to align with our own breathing. Soft, deliberate, and comforting, it's another gentle reminder of how history unfolds not only in grand events, but in the slow, patient motion of daily life. Good night, and let the calm rhythm of correspondence carry you softly into reflective sleep.
Part 15. The complete hypnotic tapestry of royal life. And now, as we arrive at the final stretch of our long, deliberate journey, let's pause and take in the entirety of what we've explored. We've wandered through centuries of monarchs, courtiers, attendants, and the quiet rhythms of life that often go unnoticed. Each act, from the smallest gesture to grand ceremonial practice, contributed to a hypnotic pattern, slow, deliberate, and oddly comforting. The lives of royalty were governed by repetition and precision. Daily routines, ceremonial arrangements, hobbies, collections, correspondence, and even posthumous planning unfolded at a measured pace. No rush, no urgency, only the steady cadence of centuries in motion. Observing these details is like listening to the gentle tick of a clock in a quiet palace corridor. Soft, persistent, and calming. We've seen infant kings and queens, carefully nurtured and observed, growing under slow rhythms of ritualized care. We've watched eccentric hobbies, tiny collections, and repetitive tasks that, while minor in isolation, together formed the hypnotic pulse of a court. Courtiers and attendants mirrored these cadences, their own lives blending seamlessly into the quiet flow. Even death maintained this gentle rhythm. Tombs, mausoleums, and posthumous arrangements unfolded with measured precision, extending centuries of deliberate care. We've observed subtle quirks and eccentricities, adjusting curtains, folding linens, positioning chairs, or cataloging tiny objects. These small acts, repeated over decades, created patterns of calm, order, and quiet eccentricity. The slow repetition of gestures, soft rustle of fabrics, faint scratching of quills, and measured footsteps across marble floors all combined to form a living, breathing rhythm of royal life. Even communication, the exchange of letters, notes, and messages, followed this gentle tempo. Monarchs, secretaries, and attendants moved slowly, carefully, deliberately, shaping not just information, but the subtle pulse of daily life. Every gesture, every correction, and every measured motion became part of a long, soothing cadence. Through it all, there is a certain irony.
Those with immense power and influence often spent their lives engaged in seemingly minor, repetitive, or slow pursuits. Yet this very repetition, soft, measured, meticulous, defines the quiet, hypnotic charm of history. It's a rhythm that persists across centuries, offering a gentle, almost soporific glimpse into lives that were, in reality, highly structured and deeply personal. And so, as we drift to the end of this ultra-long journey, imagine the corridors, gardens, and chambers, softly echoing footsteps, gently adjusted objects, meticulously arranged collections, quiet hobbies, and slowly written letters. The entire panorama of royal life, with all its subtle rhythms and peculiar habits, unfolds like a lullaby, slow, deliberate, and quietly mesmerizing. Tonight, we leave these centuries behind, not with grandeur or drama, but with calm, reflection, and a sense of continuity. The hypnotic cadence of royal existence, measured, repetitive, and filled with small, personal details, offers a quiet comfort. The past moves slowly here, and if you followed along, you've moved with it, softly, deliberately, gently. Good night. Let the slow rhythm of history, with all its minor gestures, tiny obsessions, and quiet ceremonies, carry you into a deep, restful, and reflective sleep.